Shoutouts this week to some listeners who've sent me emails with ideas for new episodes. Ashley from Houston, Richard from Champaign, Illinois, and Casey from Detroit, Michigan. Now let's go to our mailbag. This week's question asks, who was your favorite guest so far? Well, you know I can't answer that. I've enjoyed every one of our guests so far, and I won't play favorites. I'm so glad that each guest has taken their time to appear on our podcast. I can say, though, that I really like it when the people that we talk to tell stories, and they say something that reveals how much they care on a personal level about whatever it is we happen to be talking about. Today's guest is no exception. John cares deeply about the history of country music, and I think you'll enjoy this episode. So keep those emails coming. Send your thoughts to me through email at tim@shapingopinion.com, and if you want, we can give you a shout-out. As always, thank you for being a listener of the Shaping Opinion podcast. You're the reason we do this. This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. John, where can people find remnants of the Nashville sound today in today's country music?
I think the best place to look is in the recordings of Mandy Barnett, because she worked with Owen Bradley, who was another architect of the Nashville sound, in addition to Chet Atkins at RCA. Bradley was in charge of country recording for the Decca label, which became part of Universal. Mandy Barnett deliberately set out to embody the recordings and the sound and the attitude of Patsy Cline. And certainly Patsy, in lots of recordings, Sweet Dreams among them, expressed the Nashville sound.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by John Rumble. He's a senior historian at the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we'll talk with John about a humble little recording studio that has changed the course of country music history, and it made the careers of many entertainers within and outside of the country music industry. RCA Studio B in Nashville. Dan Maddox built this nondescript building on the corner of 17th Avenue South and Hawkins Street in Nashville in 1957. From the outside, there's not much to see, and even on the inside, it looks like any other recording studio from that time. But appearances aren't all that they seem. RCA Studio B became known as one of the cradles of the Nashville sound not long after it was built. In the 1960s, the Nashville sound had a sophisticated style that was characterized by background vocals and strings. The Nashville sound is credited for reviving America's interest in country music, and it helped establish Nashville as an international recording hub. A partial list of artists who recorded in RCA Studio B include Elvis Presley, Willie Nelson, Dolly Parton, Charlie Pride, Waylon Jennings, Chet Atkins, and many others. Studio B is credited for a number of recording industry innovations. You'd have to be a real musician to appreciate this, but it was in Studio B where the Nashville number system was created. This is a musician's shorthand to notate a song's chord structure. It makes it easier to create individual parts of a song's arrangements while retaining the integrity of that song. As a country music historian, one of the more common questions that John Rumble gets is, what makes Studio B so special?
It was one of the key studios in the early recording history of Nashville. It helped solidify Nashville's reputation as a recording center, and more than that, as an efficient recording center, which has a lot to do with producers and the so-called Nashville Cats. And because so many songs were recorded there that became essential parts of the fabric of American popular culture, so many songs that people remember and still discover when they explore the internet. There are so many great recordings you can access.
And when you said people are discovering them on the internet, probably YouTube and places like that, what are they looking for and what are they finding, younger people that are discovering these older musicians?
Well, I think they discover the artistry. They discover that these recordings capture emotions that help them, the younger folks, cope. You know, the Everly Brothers combined pop and country and rock and roll. And so many of those songs, for instance, had a similar approach. Think of something like All I Have to Do Is Dream, or Bye Bye Love, or Love Hurts. Nazareth had a hit with back in the 70s. I know the 70s is getting to be 50 years ago, but it was a very up-to-date approach to that song.
Before we get started into the discussion of the story of Studio B, can you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Well, I was lucky enough to grow up in a family that appreciated all sorts of music. My sister and I studied piano, the classics, Bach, Beethoven, Bartók. My dad had played in a swing band in college. When he was 19, he and that band, or rather a small combo from that band, were booked on a passenger liner named Europa, and they toured Europe. They were the ship's band and had time to get around Europe as well. So he had a pretty good jazz collection. When I came along, television had these great variety shows. Ed Sullivan, Red Skelton, Jackie Gleason, that often featured pop singers who were doing the Great American Songbook all the way back to Irving Berlin and earlier. And so you got a chance to hear these classics. So that was another aspect of my musical education. Then my sister is almost 6 years older. So when Elvis came along, boy, I was right there in front of the TV. I was only 5 years old. But when he started thrashing around and swiveling his hips and singing You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog, I thought that was pretty neat. So I started doing it. In fact, I wanted to get that record. My sister went downtown, tried to find it. It was sold out. But she brought home Bird Dog by the Everlys. She thought I would be satisfied as long as it said dog on the title. And that let me discover the Everly Brothers. And what a trove of great material they recorded.
So that was when you started to transition your focus to country music?
Well, I'd also have to mention the big folk music scare. I can very well remember the Kingston Trio and Tom Dooley in 1958. So you had Peter, Paul, and Mary and the Limelighters and all of those sorts of acts. And then I got into bluegrass. I watched Flatt and Scruggs on television, and Nashville was beaming out so many different shows.
Now, what about when you, in your professional life, what were you doing at this time when you graduated from college? Were you working in the music industry?
No. I came to Vanderbilt, right here in Nashville, to get a PhD in United States history. And I thought I was going to become a college professor, like my grandfather, and my father had taught at Tulane, and my sister was ahead of me, and so she had just started to teach at, or maybe she was still getting her PhD at Boston University. And we listened to a lot of music together and sang a lot of songs in car trips out west. And I came to Vanderbilt in the fall of 1974. And of course, I could listen to country radio as well as NPR and mainstream radio. So when I got to the point of choosing a topic for my dissertation, I had already done my master's thesis on the bluegrass explosion between 1965 and 1975. So the next step was the dissertation. And actually, the fellow who preceded me in running the oral history project for the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum was Douglas B. Green, better known as Ranger Doug in Riders of the Sky. So he said, well, why don't you look into Fred Rose's career? you could brain spin on that and produce a dissertation. So I started looking into it, and I found out Doug was right. Fred Rose started out as a pop musician and songwriter in Chicago. He had experience in New York. He wrote hits like Red Hot Mama, Deed I Do, and he wrote a lot of songs for Gene Autry between 1938 and 1942. Autry came to town and specifically recruited Fred Rose to come out and write for Autry's movies and recordings.
So you wrote your dissertation on him, and then what job did you get after you had your doctorate?
Well, I taught part-time at Vanderbilt for a couple of years, just U.S. survey courses and Southern history courses. And, the job market was pretty tight then. So a vacancy came open here at the museum to run the oral history project. And I'd already conducted dozens of interviews for my dissertation. And everybody had such an interesting story that I applied for the job and luckily got it. And I had had enough experience in academia to know that if I could do something else that would use my research and writing skills, but on a subject that I really got excited about, that was a better life than to get on a tenure track, which you might not follow all the way through, or have to take a temporary 1 or 2 year appointment at a college or university, and then hope you didn't wind up 40 years old with no job. So this looked really good, and it turned out to be so interesting, and I've never regretted making the transition out of academia.
Does it feel like work when you come to work and do your job every day?
No, it really doesn't, because if I were independently wealthy, I'd be doing research anyway and writing.
This is what you'd be doing?
This is what I'd be doing.
That's great.
Because I get to work on exhibits, other publications, participate in public programs like public interviews and panel discussions, that sort of thing.
The oral history project that you described is basically what it sounds like, collecting oral histories from people who were there or people who know people who were there. And they're telling you the history and you're collecting it for future generations to talk about. And that actually brings me to what we're talking about today, because we're here to talk about Studio B. Studio B is pretty well known to people who are from Nashville or live around Nashville or know the music scene. But beyond that, there may be this underestimation of what Studio B has meant to the country music industry and, in a sense, music in general, because that particular studio was as influential on music as some of the more famous studios that you hear about, like Sun Studios from Elvis or like the Motown Studios in Detroit. Can you tell us about Studio B itself? In 1957, it was launched. How was it equipped? Was it state-of-the-art at that time?
Actually, probably not. When a certain engineer named Bill Porter started in 1959, and the studio had a 2-output mixing panel that was created by wiring 2 4-input radio mixing panels together. And there was an echo chamber above the studio space. That's what tourists can't really see. And they had an EMT German, well, it was actually an EMT device, which allowed engineers to put reverb on an output channel. But you have to remember that most of the recordings that were put out were mono. So they ran simultaneously a mono recording machine, a 2-track machine, and then the 3-track machine.
I think one of the things that Studio B had as a challenge and a benefit was it was a small studio, and they did everything live at that time. They didn't do everything on separate tracks. So you didn't have a person come in and play bass and then someone else come in an hour later and play the guitar and something else. You would have everybody play their song live and just do take after take after take. But one of the problems they had was there was this bleed sound, like you and I are talking now off 2 microphones, and your microphone's picking up my voice and my microphone's picking up your voice. But they had that problem then. But so they had to do certain things in the studio to keep the person playing the guitar from bleeding over into the person singing in the microphone. So they had to do a lot of crazy things. And from what I read about Studio B, one of the ways they did it, I think Bill Porter was the guy you said, they would test out the studio in different parts and they would find out where the distance was proper so that the musician would not bleed over into the vocalist's microphone. So they would actually have the person playing the guitar over there, the person playing the piano over on the other corner. It didn't look quite right, but at least it kept the sound right. Is that true?
Well, essentially it is. Bill Porter and his chief assistant, who was named Tommy Strong, they would come in to the studio when nobody else was there, and they would test microphone positions. And more than that, the type of microphone could be varied for a particular instrument, for the vocalist, for different vocalists. And so they knew where they took tape and marked X's on the floor to put microphones so they could just quickly set them up. Now, the drums you couldn't do much about, so they did isolate the vocalists to a certain extent with kind of a primitive 3 sides of a room.
Looks like a cubicle.
Exactly right. But people who were involved, the singers could control their own volume and tone. The musicians knew how far to sit from the microphone, and they could